The aroma of honeysuckle and freshly cut grass hung heavy in the air, a perfect scent for the exclusive garden party at the Sterling estate. Everything was meticulously arranged. The string quartet played a classical melody, crystal flutes shimmered with champagne, and laughter rippled through the well-dressed guests. Yet, amidst this picture of perfection, a small, solitary figure sat apart. 9-year-old Ethan Sterling, deaf since birth, was a silent island in a sea of sound, his bright blue eyes distant, his small hands resting motionless on his lap. His father, Mr. Sterling, a man whose name was synonymous with success and who could buy anything, stood by the fountain, nodding politely to investors, but his gaze kept drifting to his son. 7 months. 7 months since Ethan had retreated into an impenetrable silence following the sudden loss of his mother. Dozens of specialists, the most expensive therapies, the most experienced nannies, all had failed. Everyone said reaching Ethan was impossible. But impossible had a funny way of challenging those who dared to believe in it. And soon, they would discover that impossible was simply a word waiting to be redefined. The afternoon sun, a warm Georgia embrace, dappled through the ancient oak trees that framed the Sterling estate. Sunlight danced on tables draped in pristine white linen, making the polished silverware gleam like scattered jewels. The soft clinking of glasses and the murmur of polite conversation created a sophisticated hum, a backdrop to the exclusive gathering. Robert Sterling, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, moved through the throng with the effortless grace of a man accustomed to command. He shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, and smiled precisely when expected, a master of the social dance. This garden party, like everything in his life, was a testament to his curated success, a flawless tableau designed to impress. But a single, poignant flaw marred his perfect scene. At a secluded table near the vibrant rose bushes, away from the boisterous center of the party, sat Ethan. 9 years old, with sun-streaked blonde hair falling over his forehead and eyes the color of a summer sky before a storm, he remained utterly still. His small hands lay on either side of an untouched plate, grilled salmon, asparagus, a delicate orzo salad, all artfully arranged, all slowly growing cold. His gaze was fixed, not on the blossoms or the guests, but on some unseen point in the distance, a world beyond the present. He didn't fidget, didn't glance around. He simply existed, separate. 3 nannies, dressed in crisp white polo shirts and khaki pants, uniforms that spoke of competence, though their strained postures hinted at something less, hovered near Ethan. The tallest, a woman named Sharon, her blonde hair pulled into a severe ponytail, leaned towards Ethan. Her movements were slow, almost exaggerated, her face a mask of what she hoped was encouragement, but read more as exasperation. "Ethan," she articulated, her voice too loud, too drawn out. "Eat your lunch." Her hands formed large, clumsy gestures in the air, a rudimentary attempt at sign language, akin to a child's crude drawing compared to a masterful painting. Ethan's eyes flickered towards her for the briefest instant, then slid away, dismissing her completely. Sharon's jaw tightened. She straightened, exchanging a glance with the other 2. Rachel, with her reddish-brown hair and glasses constantly slipping down her nose, adjusted them nervously before trying her own tactic. "Maybe he's not hungry," she offered, though her voice lacked conviction. She crouched beside Ethan's chair, attempting to intercept his line of sight. "Ethan, can you look at me, sweetie?" Nothing. Not even a subtle acknowledgement. The third nanny, Bethany, a woman in her late 50s with streaks of gray in her dark hair and deep lines etched around her mouth from years of managing difficult children, crossed her arms. "He knows we're here," she stated softly. "He's choosing to ignore us." "We should try the visual cards again," Rachel suggested, pulling a laminated set from her pocket. Each card displayed a simple image: a fork, a glass of water, a toilet, a bed. She held them up, one by one, enunciating each word slowly and clearly. "Do you need anything, Ethan? Water? Bathroom?" Ethan's fingers twitched slightly where they rested on the table, but he remained otherwise unresponsive. The cards might as well have been invisible. Across the sprawling lawn, a few guests had begun to notice. A man in a tailored gray suit leaned conspiratorially towards his companion, whispering behind his hand. A woman in a vibrant floral dress glanced at Ethan's table, then quickly averted her gaze, her expression a mix of discomfort and polite concern. The whispers spread, quiet but persistent, like ripples on the surface of still water. Robert Sterling stood near the elegantly appointed bar, a glass of untouched scotch in his hand. He appeared to be absorbed in a conversation with a silver-haired investor discussing market trends, nodding at precisely the right moments. But his attention was fractured, constantly drawn to that small, isolated table amidst the roses. He observed Sharon's frustrated gestures, Rachel's pleading attempts, Bethany's stiff disapproval. He watched his son, a motionless statue, alone despite the proximity of his caregivers. Robert's jaw clenched, a muscle jumping subtly in his cheek. To any casual observer, he radiated calm, control, perhaps a hint of boredom. Only someone intimately familiar with him would detect the raw fury and profound helplessness warring beneath his composed exterior. He took a small, deliberate sip of scotch, letting the burn trace a path down his throat, and forced his focus back to the investor. "The third quarter projections look solid," he stated smoothly, as if nothing in his world could possibly be amiss. It had been 7 months since Ethan had retreated into his profound silence. 7 months since Robert had discovered his wife, Clara, collapsed in their bedroom, a sudden aneurysm having stolen her away without a whisper of warning. 7 months since Ethan had witnessed the frantic efforts of paramedics, had seen his father's face contort in an agony beyond words, had felt his own world shatter into fragments too small to ever be reassembled. For the first month, everyone assured Robert it was a natural phase. Grief was a lengthy process. Children process loss uniquely. Be patient. Grant him space. But as the weeks bled into months, Ethan's silence deepened, transforming into something far more alarming. He stopped responding to his name, avoided eye contact, and disengaged entirely from his surroundings. Therapists labeled it trauma-linked withdrawal. Doctors conducted extensive tests, finding no physical ailments. Specialists offered similar advice: time, patience, specialized care. Robert had confronted the problem with the only tool he truly believed in: money. He had thrown vast sums at it, as if it were a raging fire he could extinguish with an endless supply of cash. He hired the most renowned child psychologists in the country, brought in speech therapists, occupational therapists, behavioral specialists. He employed nannies whose resumes were longer than most novels, women who had worked with deaf children in elite schools, held certifications from prestigious institutions, and came with glowing references and confident promises. None of them lasted more than 2 weeks. They all eventually articulated the same verdict: Ethan was too withdrawn, too resistant to intervention, too profoundly traumatized to be reached. Some suggested medication, others recommended residential programs. Ultimately, every single one of them quit. Each departure, each failure, felt like another agonizing confirmation of a truth Robert couldn't bear to acknowledge: that perhaps his son was broken in a way that couldn't be mended. That perhaps even his vast wealth, power, and influence were utterly useless. That perhaps he had failed at the one thing that truly mattered. Near the dessert table, a woman in a simple black uniform moved with quiet efficiency among the guests. She wore no name tag, no distinguishing features. Her dark skin glowed softly in the afternoon light, and her hair was neatly gathered into a bun at the nape of her neck. She carried a tray, collecting empty glasses and plates, refilling water goblets without a word. Most guests didn't truly see her. She was part of the invisible machinery that ensured events like this ran flawlessly, present but unacknowledged, essential but unseen. Her name was Maya Jackson, and she had been working at the Sterling estate for precisely 3 weeks. She had been hired through a staffing agency after the previous maid abruptly resigned, citing the tense atmosphere. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Davison, a stern woman with an unyielding demeanor, had interviewed Maya briefly, asked a few perfunctory questions about her experience, and hired her on the spot. They needed someone immediately, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions, someone who understood that working for a family like the Sterlings demanded absolute discretion. Maya understood all of it. She desperately needed the job. The pay was significantly better than any previous employment, and it included housing, a small, clean, private room in the staff quarters. She kept her head down, performed her duties meticulously, and tried to remain as unobtrusive as possible. But she couldn't help but notice things. As she moved through the garden party, clearing champagne flutes and replacing them with fresh ones, her gaze repeatedly returned to the small table near the roses. She watched the nannies hover, gesture, and ultimately fail. She watched the little boy sit cocooned in his isolation, and she observed details that no one else seemed to perceive. She noticed how Ethan's fingers twitched whenever someone spoke too loudly nearby, not a flinch, but a subtle, almost imperceptible response that suggested an awareness of vibrations, of shifts in air pressure, of the physical presence of sound, even if he couldn't hear it. She noticed how his eyes would track movement in his peripheral vision, following patterns and gestures even when he appeared to be looking away. She noticed how he would unconsciously mirror people. When Sharon crossed her arms, Ethan's shoulders would subtly tense in a similar, protective posture. When Rachel leaned forward, Ethan would lean slightly back, maintaining his distance. Most revealing of all, she noticed that Ethan would freeze whenever someone noticed him noticing, as if awareness itself was dangerous, as if being seen meant vulnerability. Maya paused near the bar to collect a cluster of empty glasses. As she straightened, she overheard Sharon's voice, sharp with barely concealed frustration. "Ethan, this is not acceptable behavior. You need to eat your lunch now." The cutting edge in her tone made Maya's hands still on the tray. She watched as Sharon reached towards Ethan's plate, as if to physically guide his hand to the fork. Ethan pulled his hands into his lap with a speed that was almost violent, his entire body rigid. "Don't touch him like that," Bethany interjected, her voice sharp to Sharon. "You know the protocols." "The protocols aren't working," Sharon hissed back. "Nothing is working. He's being deliberately difficult." Maya felt a knot tighten in her chest. Not quite anger, but a prickle of alarm, a protective instinct stirring within her. She didn't know this child, had no right to feel anything about how he was treated. But the word, deliberately, resonated in her mind with a profound wrongness that made her jaw clench. She moved on, continuing her work, but the unsettling feeling lingered. Near the rose garden, Robert excused himself from the investor and walked towards his son's table. The nannies immediately straightened, their expressions shifting to professional composure. Robert stopped a few feet away, not approaching too closely. He looked at his son, truly looked at him, and for a fleeting moment, his meticulously constructed mask fractured. Raw, undeniable grief and helplessness showed through. Then, he locked it away again. He turned to Sharon. "How is he doing today?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Sharon hesitated, clearly choosing her words with caution. "He's having a difficult afternoon, Mr. Sterling. We've attempted several approaches, but he's unresponsive to any of our interventions." Robert's eyes returned to Ethan. His son hadn't acknowledged his presence at all, hadn't even turned his head. "Has he eaten anything?" "No, sir." "Has he signed anything? Made any attempt to communicate?" "No, sir." "Not since this morning." Robert nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Keep trying," he said, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. What else was there to say? What else was there to do? He walked away before anyone could witness the defeat etched in his eyes. The party wound down over the next 2 hours. Guests mingled, laughed, and discussed business over expensive wines. The sun arced across the sky, casting longer shadows. Eventually, people began to depart, offering gracious thanks and promises to remain in touch. Robert played his role flawlessly, shaking hands and accepting compliments on the exquisite event. As the last guest departed, Maya found herself near Ethan's table, collecting the scattered remnants of the party. The nannies had finally given up and escorted Ethan inside. His untouched plate still sat on the table, the food congealed and unappetizing. As Maya reached for it, she noticed something she had previously missed. The fork beside the plate had been moved, not randomly, but with deliberate intent. It had been positioned to form a perfect perpendicular angle with the knife, creating a precise T-shape. The spoon had been placed above them, equidistant from both edges. The water glass had been rotated so that the small chip in its rim faced exactly north. It was a pattern, a meticulous, careful pattern that someone with acute spatial awareness might create. Not chaos, not withdrawal. Communication. Maya stood there for a long moment, simply staring at the geometric arrangement. Then, she carefully committed every angle to memory before clearing the table away. That evening, a guest's comment drifted back to Robert through the estate's whisper network, the way cruel observations always did. Someone had said it to someone else, who mentioned it to a board member, who felt obligated to relay it. Poor kid! All that money and still broken. The word landed like a physical blow. Broken. As if Ethan were a toy that had simply stopped working. As if grief, trauma, and the loss of the only person who truly understood him were mere mechanical failures that could be remedied with the right tools and enough money. Robert dismissed his staff early that night. He poured himself another scotch, this one he actually intended to drink, and sat alone in his office. The room was dim, illuminated only by the soft glow of his laptop screen. He opened a folder he had sworn he wouldn't touch anymore, videos, dozens of them, of Clara and Ethan filmed over the years on phones and cameras. Casual, unremarkable moments captured in time. He clicked on one from 2 years ago, a summer day. Clara and Ethan in this very garden, sunshine pouring over them like liquid gold. Clara's hands moved in fluid, graceful signs, and Ethan responded with his own gestures, quick, confident, and full of life. They were laughing, both of them. Ethan's face was open and bright, utterly unlike the closed, distant mask he wore now. Clara signed something intricate, her expression playful. Ethan signed back, giggling. The sound was absent from the video, just the whisper of wind through the trees and distant birdsong. But Robert remembered what it had sounded like, his son's laughter, high, clear, and absolutely joyful. Robert watched for 2 minutes. Then, he slammed the laptop shut, unable to bear another moment. In the oppressive darkness of his office, surrounded by the gleaming symbols of his success, awards, photographs, expensive furniture, Robert Sterling buried his face in his hands and wondered how he had failed so profoundly at the only thing that truly mattered. Maya Jackson's room in the staff quarters was small but comfortable, a narrow bed with crisp white sheets, a 4-drawer dresser, a small window overlooking the service driveway. She had lived in it for 3 weeks, and it still felt temporary. She hadn't hung anything on the walls or placed photographs on the dresser. Her belongings were minimal, ready to be packed at a moment's notice if necessary. She had learned early in life not to get too attached to places. Maya grew up in a small town in North Carolina, the daughter of a single mother who worked tirelessly as a nurse. Her mother, Diane, had taken double shifts at the county hospital for as long as Maya could remember, returning home exhausted, sleeping for a few hours, then heading back out before dawn. Money was always scarce, time even scarcer, but there was an abundance of love, fierce, uncompromising, and a work ethic that bordered on the sacred. When Maya was 11, her cousin, Marcus, came to live with them. He was 8 years old, deaf since birth, and his parents, Diane's brother and sister-in-law, had died in a car accident on a rain-slicked highway outside Charlotte. There was no one else to take him in. Diane didn't hesitate. She brought Marcus home, cleared out the spare room that had been used for storage, and told Maya, "Family takes care of family, no matter what." Marcus arrived silent and terrified, clutching a worn, stuffed dog, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. The social worker explained that he had some sign language education, but was delayed for his age. He had behavioral issues, struggled with change, and would require special schools, therapists, and accommodations. Diane listened intently, thanked the social worker, and closed the door. Then, she looked at Maya and said, "We'll figure it out." And they did. Not with money or experts or specialized programs, but by paying attention, by observing Marcus closely, learning what made him feel safe and what made him withdraw. They taught themselves sign language from library books and free community classes, making mistakes and trying again. Maya learned that signing wasn't merely about forming the correct shapes with your hands. It was about expression, intention, emotional clarity. You could sign, "I love you," in a way that felt perfunctory and distant, or in a way that enveloped the person in warmth. The difference wasn't in the technical execution, it was in whether you truly meant it. She learned that Marcus communicated even when he wasn't signing. His body language told stories. The way he arranged his toys, tapped his fingers, or avoided certain rooms, it all meant something. You just had to pay attention. You had to care enough to truly see. By the time Marcus was 12 and Maya was 15, he was a transformed child, confident, expressive, playful. He still faced challenges. School was difficult, other kids could be cruel, and the world wasn't designed for him. But he had a foundation. He had people who saw him. Maya had always planned to become a certified interpreter. She had the skills, the passion. But life, as it often does, had a way of interrupting plans. Her mother became ill during Maya's senior year, cancer, aggressive and unforgiving. Medical bills piled up faster than Diane's insurance could cover them. Maya graduated high school and immediately entered the workforce, taking any job she could find to help pay for treatment. Diane fought valiantly but ultimately lost the battle, passing away 3 weeks before Maya's 21st birthday. Marcus went to live with another relative, an aunt in Virginia, who could provide the stability and structure he needed. Maya was left alone, burdened by debt, without a degree or a clear path forward. She navigated her 20s working whatever jobs paid the bills, waitressing, retail, cleaning houses. She moved from town to town, never truly settling, never building anything permanent. She kept her sign language sharp by practicing alone in her apartment at night, reviewing vocabulary and grammar, keeping the language alive even though she had no one to use it with. She told herself she would eventually return to school, get certified, build a real career, but eventually kept being pushed further into the future, always just out of reach. Now, at 32, she was cleaning tables at a billionaire's estate and sleeping in staff quarters. It wasn't where she had envisioned herself, but at least it offered stability. At least it was something. On her 4th day at the Sterling estate, Mrs. Davison summoned Maya to her office. The head housekeeper, a severe woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to taunt her entire face, sat behind a meticulously organized desk, her posture militarily straight. She regarded Maya with a cool, assessing gaze. "I want to be very clear about something," Mrs. Davison began without preamble. "You are here to maintain the household. You clean, you serve, you perform whatever tasks are assigned to you. That is the extent of your responsibilities. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Maya replied. "You do not interact with Mr. Sterling unless directly addressed. You do not gossip about the family with other staff. And under no circumstances do you interact with the child." Mrs. Davison's eyes sharpened on that last point. "Ethan has specialized caregivers. That is not your job. That is not your place. Am I clear?" "Crystal clear, ma'am." Mrs. Davison held her gaze for another moment, then nodded. "Good. You may go." Maya understood the message. She was the help. She was meant to be invisible. She was not to deviate from the confines of her position under any circumstances. She meticulously followed those rules. When she worked in rooms where Ethan was present, she kept her eyes on her tasks. When she passed him in hallways, she stepped aside without looking directly at him. When she overheard the nannies discussing his lack of progress, she remained silent. But she continued to observe. She couldn't help herself. She noticed Ethan had distinct patterns. Every morning at breakfast, he would arrange his silverware in specific configurations before ignoring the food entirely. Sometimes it was geometric, triangles, squares, parallel lines. Sometimes it was sequential, fork, knife, spoon, fork, knife, spoon. The arrangements varied daily, but they were never random. She noticed that he responded to rhythm. When a nanny would tap her foot impatiently, Ethan's fingers would tap in response, matching the pattern. When someone walked past with hard-soled shoes clicking against marble, his head would tilt slightly, tracking the sound through vibration. She noticed that he watched faces obsessively, not in a social way, not trying to make connections, but studying, learning. When people spoke, he would watch their lips and expressions with fierce concentration, as if attempting to decode a foreign language. Most profoundly, she noticed that he wasn't withdrawn in the way everyone assumed. He was listening. He was communicating. No one else was paying close enough attention to see it. One afternoon, Maya was polishing silver in the formal dining room when she overheard raised voices from the adjacent room. She paused, recognizing one of the nannies, Sharon, speaking sharply. "I don't know what else you want me to try, Mr. Sterling. I have 15 years of experience working with deaf children. This isn't about technique. He's actively resisting engagement." "Then figure out why." Robert's voice cut back, cold and controlled. "With all due respect, sir, that's a question for his therapist, not his nanny." There was a pause. Then Robert spoke again, and this time his voice carried an edge that made Maya's hands still. "I have hired 6 therapists in 7 months. None of them have answers. I need someone who can actually reach my son, not someone who can explain why it's impossible." Sharon's response was quiet, defensive. "I'm doing everything I can." "Then do more." Footsteps, sharp and angry. The conversation concluded. That evening, Sharon packed her belongings and left. She was the 3rd nanny to quit in the 6 weeks since Maya had been hired. The pattern was consistently the same: arrival with confidence, weeks of frustrated attempts, resignation tinged with guilt and relief. The next morning, a new nanny arrived. Her name was Sarah, and she lasted 4 days. Maya watched the cycle repeat. She watched Robert's frustration harden into something closer to despair. She watched Ethan become more isolated with each failed intervention. She watched, and she said nothing. And she felt something building inside her that she couldn't quite name, not just sympathy, not just recognition, but something more complicated, a pull, an ache. One evening, Maya was tidying up after dinner service when she found herself alone in the small breakfast room adjacent to the kitchen. Most of the staff had retired to their quarters. The house was quiet. She had been assigned to polish the silver tea service, a task that would take at least an hour. She worked methodically, her hands moving in familiar patterns, her mind elsewhere. Without conscious thought, she began to hum. Not a specific song, just a melody, a rhythm. Her mother used to hum while cooking, a habit Maya had inherited without realizing it. She was so engrossed in her work that she didn't notice Ethan standing in the doorway. He had come downstairs alone, which wasn't unusual. The nannies had learned not to hover over him constantly. It only made him more resistant. He often wandered the house at night, and the staff had been instructed to leave him alone unless he appeared distressed. He stood in the doorway now, watching Maya work. His expression was unreadable, but his fingers moved slightly at his sides, tapping against his pajama pants. Tap tap pause tap tap tap, the exact rhythm of Maya's humming. Maya sensed his presence before she saw him. She glanced up, startled, and their eyes met for a fraction of a second before Ethan looked away. She didn't speak, didn't try to engage him. She simply returned to her work, continuing to hum softly. Ethan remained in the doorway, his fingers still tapping, perfectly matching her rhythm. After a few minutes, Maya subtly altered her melody, shifting to a different pattern. Tap pause tap tap pause tap. Ethan's fingers shifted to match. Maya felt her heart rate quicken, but she maintained a neutral expression, her movements steady. She didn't look at him again, didn't draw attention to what was happening. She simply continued working, allowing the rhythm to flow between them like a conversation conducted in a language no one else could hear. When she finished polishing the tea service, she carefully put everything away. She turned off the light in the breakfast room and walked towards the staff quarters. As she passed the doorway where Ethan stood, she didn't look at him, didn't speak. She simply walked by as if he were invisible. Behind her, she heard the soft pad of small feet heading back upstairs. That night, alone in her room, Maya sat on the edge of her bed and practiced signs she hadn't used in years. Her hands formed shapes in the dim light, greetings, questions, emotions. She ran through vocabulary, grammar, emotional inflection. She had no plan to use any of it. She was just keeping the language alive, keeping herself ready for something she couldn't yet name. 2 days later, another nanny quit. This one lasted less than a week. She told Mrs. Davison that working with Ethan was emotionally exhausting, that she felt like she was constantly failing, and that she couldn't endure the pressure anymore. Robert exploded. Maya was in the hallway outside his office when she heard him shouting, not at anyone specific, but into the void, demanding to know why no one could do their job, why everyone gave up, why his son was being treated like an impossible problem instead of a child who needed help. The shouting stopped abruptly. Then came silence. Then, very quietly, the sound of something breaking, glass, perhaps, something small and sharp. Mrs. Davison emerged from the office looking pale. She closed the door carefully behind her and walked past Maya without acknowledging her presence. The next day, Robert made an announcement to the remaining staff. He was bringing in a world-renowned specialist from Switzerland. Dr. Klaus Schmidt had authored books on developmental trauma in deaf children. His success rate was reportedly extraordinary. He would arrive next week and spend 2 weeks evaluating Ethan. "This is our last attempt," Robert stated, his voice flat and exhausted. "If Dr. Schmidt can't help him, then we'll have to consider other options." Other options. Everyone understood what that meant: residential facilities, institutionalization, sending Ethan away. Maya felt the words like stones in her stomach. She kept her face neutral, her eyes down, her expression carefully blank. It wasn't her place to care. It wasn't her place to object. But she cared anyway. And as she went about her work that day, she caught herself watching Ethan more closely, as if trying to memorize him before he disappeared. The days leading up to Dr. Schmidt's arrival felt like waiting for a verdict. The entire household operated under a strange tension, as if everyone understood that something significant was about to happen, but no one dared speak it aloud. Maya continued her work with quiet efficiency, but she felt the weight of the impending evaluation pressing down on everything she did. She found herself observing Ethan even more carefully during those days, noticing details she had previously missed, cataloging patterns that felt increasingly urgent to understand. Dr. Klaus Schmidt arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning in a sleek black car that looked more like a hearse than a vehicle carrying hope. He was a tall man in his 60s with silver hair combed precisely back from a high forehead and wire-rimmed glasses that caught the light in sharp angles. He wore a dark suit and carried a leather briefcase that looked both expensive and well-traveled. Everything about him communicated authority, expertise, and the kind of unwavering confidence that stemmed from decades of being right. Robert met him at the front door personally, shaking his hand with a grip that lingered a fraction too long, desperation thinly masked as courtesy. Mrs. Davison hovered nearby, poised to attend to whatever the doctor might require. 2 new nannies, recent hires named Caroline and Michelle, stood at attention in the foyer, having been extensively briefed on Dr. Schmidt's methods and expectations. Maya watched from the second-floor landing, ostensibly dusting a table that didn't need dusting. She saw Dr. Schmidt's eyes sweep the grand entrance hall with clinical assessment, taking in the marble floors, the crystal chandelier, and the original artwork on the walls. She saw Robert's shoulders tense as he led the doctor towards his office for a preliminary consultation. The evaluation was scheduled to commence that afternoon with another garden luncheon. Robert had insisted on it, wanting to observe Ethan in a social setting, wanting to vividly demonstrate the scope of the problem to the specialist who was supposed to solve it. The setup mirrored the party from weeks earlier: elegant tables, pristine linens, carefully arranged food. This time, however, the guest list was smaller, just a few close business associates and their families, individuals who could be trusted to witness what might be another failure without widely spreading gossip. Ethan was brought to his usual table near the roses. He wore a light blue button-down shirt and khaki pants, his hair recently trimmed, looking like a miniature version of his father. Caroline and Michelle positioned themselves nearby, their postures alert and professional. Dr. Schmidt took a seat at a different table with an unobstructed view of the child, a leather notebook open in front of him, a gold pen poised to record observations. Maya had been assigned to serve drinks during the luncheon. She moved through the space with practiced invisibility, refilling glasses and removing empty plates. Her position afforded her the perfect vantage point to observe everything without appearing to observe anything at all. For the first 20 minutes, Dr. Schmidt simply watched. He made occasional notes in his precise handwriting, but otherwise remained still. Ethan sat at his table with his usual untouched plate, his gaze directed somewhere past the garden toward the treeling. His hands rested on either side of his silverware, fingers occasionally twitching, but otherwise motionless. Then Dr. Schmidt stood. He approached Ethan's table with measured steps, his expression neutral and clinical. Caroline and Michelle respectfully stepped back, granting the expert room to work. Several guests noticed and fell silent, curiosity overcoming politeness. Dr. Schmidt sat down directly across from Ethan. He placed his hands flat on the table, palms down, and leaned forward slightly. When he spoke, his voice was firm and clear, each word enunciated with precision. "Ethan, my name is Dr. Schmidt. I'm here to help you." Nothing. No response. Ethan's eyes didn't shift toward the doctor at all. Dr. Schmidt's expression didn't change. He raised his hands and began to sign. His technique was flawless, textbook perfect, each gesture crisp and exact. He signed his introduction again, then waited. Still nothing. "Ethan, I need you to look at me." Dr. Schmidt's voice now carried an edge, not quite impatience, but something firmer, an expectation. "We cannot make progress if you refuse to engage." He reached across the table and placed his hand directly in Ethan's line of sight, waving slightly to capture his attention. The gesture was clinical, almost aggressive in its insistence. Ethan's entire body went rigid. His shoulders pulled up towards his ears, his hands curled into fists against his thighs, and his breathing became shallow and quick. Every line of his posture screamed discomfort. Dr. Schmidt withdrew his hand but continued speaking undeterred. "This defensive response is typical of trauma-based withdrawal. The key is persistent, structured intervention." He wasn't speaking to Ethan anymore, but to Robert, who had moved closer to observe. "You must establish that engagement is not optional. The child must learn that communication is a requirement, not a choice." Maya felt something cold settle in her chest. She stood near the beverage table, holding a pitcher of iced tea, watching this interaction unfold. She saw Ethan shrink further into himself with each word the doctor spoke. She saw the way his fingers trembled against his legs. She saw the panic building behind his carefully blank expression. Dr. Schmidt attempted several more approaches over the next 15 minutes. He showed Ethan picture cards. He demonstrated objects, a ball, a book, a toy car, and attempted to engage him in parallel play. He used a tablet with communication software, holding it directly in front of Ethan's face. Each attempt was technically correct, methodologically sound, and completely ineffective. Finally, Dr. Schmidt stood, brushing imaginary dust from his suit. He turned to Robert with an expression that managed to be both sympathetic and condescending. "As I suspected, the withdrawal is profound. This will require intensive intervention. I recommend we begin a structured program immediately, 6 hours daily, incorporating multiple modalities." Robert nodded, his jaw tight. He looked at his son, still frozen at the table, and something in his face cracked just slightly before he forced it back into place. The luncheon continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Conversations became quieter, more subdued. Several guests made excuses to leave early. Ethan remained at his table, untouched food growing cold, his small hands now resting flat against the tablecloth. Maya noticed something the others had missed. Ethan's right index finger was moving, just barely, tracing shapes on the white linen, over and over, the same shape, a circle, perfect and continuous, around and around and around. An anxiety loop, a self-soothing mechanism, a silent scream that no one else was seeing. She set down the pitcher of tea and picked up a serving tray that needed to be cleared. As she moved past Ethan's table, she paused to collect an empty water glass from a nearby chair. Her hands worked automatically, arranging items on the tray, but her right index finger, the one closest to Ethan, began moving against the silver surface. A circle, the same circle Ethan was tracing, slow and deliberate, not facing him, not demanding his attention, just existing in the same space, making the same shape. She saw Ethan's finger still, saw his eyes flicker toward her hand, saw him watch the circle she was creating. Maya continued the motion for a few seconds, then slowly changed it. She let the circle spiral inward, tightening gradually until it reached a center point. Then she stopped, picked up the tray, and walked away. She didn't look back. She didn't check to see if he had noticed. She simply moved on to her next task, clearing tables and refilling glasses as if nothing had happened. Behind her, after several long seconds, Ethan's finger began moving again. This time, instead of tracing circles, he created a spiral, inward and inward until it reached a point. Then he stopped. His shoulders dropped slightly. His breathing slowed. The panic that had been building behind his eyes eased back into something calmer. Dr. Schmidt, consulting with Robert near the house, noticed none of this. Caroline and Michelle, busy preparing Ethan's afternoon therapy schedule, saw nothing unusual. The remaining guests paid no attention to the silent child at the edge of the garden. But Ethan noticed. For the first time in 7 months, someone had spoken his language without demanding anything in return. That evening, as Maya was finishing her duties in the dining room, she found a cloth napkin folded near where she had placed a stack of clean linens earlier. It wasn't folded in the standard way the staff had been trained to fold them, a simple rectangle with precise edges. This one had been folded into a spiral shape, each layer wrapping tighter than the last, creating a three-dimensional sculpture that must have required careful attention to create. Maya picked it up slowly, turning it in her hands. Her throat felt tight. She looked around the empty room, then carefully tucked the napkin into her apron pocket. The next morning, Robert reviewed the security footage from the luncheon. He did this obsessively now, watching and rewatching interactions with Ethan, searching for clues that might explain his son's protracted silence. He had watched Dr. Schmidt's intervention 3 times, taking notes, trying to understand why it had failed like all the others. Then he noticed something he had missed during the actual event. A moment near the end of the luncheon, the camera angle showed Ethan's table from above, capturing both him and the maid, Maya. He remembered her name now, as she moved past with a tray. Robert leaned closer to the screen. He watched Ethan's finger tracing circles. Watched Maya's finger doing the same thing on her tray. Watched the spiral. Watched his son's entire body language change from rigid panic to something softer. Robert replayed the sequence 4 times. Then he sat back in his chair, staring at the frozen image on the screen. The maid, the woman he had barely noticed. The staff member who was supposed to be invisible. She had done something. Something small and quiet and undeniable. She had reached his son in a way that no specialist, no therapist, no expensive expert had managed. He felt a complicated knot of emotions tighten in his chest. Hope, yes, but also suspicion, resentment, fear. Who was this woman? What gave her the right to do what trained professionals couldn't? What if she was somehow manipulating the situation? What if this was coincidence, not connection? But then he watched the footage again and saw the spiral napkin Ethan had created later, left carefully where Maya would find it. Communication. Deliberate. Chosen. Robert closed the laptop and sat in the darkness of his office, trying to decide what to do with this information. The summons came the next afternoon. Mrs. Davison appeared in the laundry room where Maya was folding linens and informed her, in a tone that allowed for no questions, that Mr. Sterling required her presence in his office immediately. Maya's stomach dropped. She carefully set down the sheet she had been folding, smoothed her uniform, and followed Mrs. Davison through the sprawling house. The walk felt endless. She ran through possibilities in her mind. Had she done something wrong? Had someone complained about her work? Was she being fired? Mrs. Davison knocked once on the office door, then opened it without waiting for a response. "The maid, sir," she announced, as if Maya were a package being delivered. "Thank you, Mrs. Davison. You may go." Robert's voice was controlled, giving nothing away. Mrs. Davison left, closing the door quietly behind her. Maya stood just inside the office, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes downcast. The room smelled of leather and expensive scotch. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined two walls. A massive mahogany desk dominated the space, and behind it sat Robert Sterling, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing, just studied her with an intensity that made Maya's skin prickle. Then he gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Sit." It wasn't a request. Maya sat, maintaining a straight posture, her hands folded in her lap. Robert turned his laptop towards her. On the screen was frozen security footage, her standing near Ethan's table, her finger tracing shapes on a serving tray. He pressed play. They watched the sequence together in silence. When it ended, Robert closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. "Care to explain what I just watched?" Maya chose her words carefully. "I was clearing tables, sir." "That's not what I'm asking about." His voice sharpened. "You engaged with my son. You were specifically instructed not to interact with him under any circumstances. Yet here you are, deliberately communicating with him behind my back." "I didn't speak to him, sir. I didn't approach him directly. Don't play semantic games with me." Robert's jaw tightened. "You knew exactly what you were doing. That wasn't random. That was deliberate communication." Maya met his eyes for the first time. "Yes, sir. It was." The admission seemed to catch him off guard. He had expected denial, excuses, deflection. Instead, she offered honesty, direct and unadorned. "Who do you think you are?" The question came out harsh, almost angry. "Do you have any idea how many specialists have tried to reach my son? How many trained professionals with decades of experience have failed? And you, a maid with no credentials, no authority, you think you can just waltz in and fix him?" "I wasn't trying to fix him, sir." Maya's voice remained calm, steady. "I was listening." "He's deaf," Robert said, as if explaining something obvious to someone obtuse. "There's nothing to listen to." Maya felt something shift inside her. A line being drawn. She could back down now, apologize, promise never to overstep again. She could keep her job, her safety, her invisibility. But then she thought of Ethan's finger-tracing circles. The spiral napkin. The 7 months of silence that wasn't really silence at all. "That's not what deaf means," she said quietly. The words hung in the air between them. Robert's expression darkened, a storm gathering behind his eyes. "Excuse me? Being deaf doesn't mean he's not communicating. It means people aren't listening in the right language." Maya kept her voice gentle but firm. "He's been talking this whole time. The patterns with his silverware, the way he responds to rhythm, the shapes he creates. He's telling everyone exactly what he needs. No one's paying attention." Robert stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. He moved to the window, his back to Maya, his shoulders rigid with tension. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. "You've been working here for less than a month. You've had minimal contact with my son. You have no training, no credentials, no authority, and yet you're standing here telling me that I don't understand my own child." "I'm not saying that, sir." "Then what exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that sometimes understanding doesn't come from training. It comes from recognition." Maya paused, then added softly, "I had a cousin. He was deaf. He taught me that listening isn't just about sound." Robert turned from the window, studying her with new intensity. "And what makes you think your experience with one child qualifies you to assess my son's condition?" "It doesn't qualify me for anything." Maya met his gaze steadily. "But it helps me see what he's trying to say." "Then enlighten me." The sarcasm in his voice was sharp. "What is my son saying?" Maya took a breath. This was the line. Once she crossed it, there would be no going back. He's saying that he's afraid. That everyone who tries to reach him wants something from him. A response, a reaction, proof that their methods work. They need him to validate their expertise. He can feel that need, and it makes him shut down harder. And you don't need anything from him? No, sir. I just noticed him. Robert laughed, but there was no humor in it. You noticed him. That's your revolutionary approach? Noticing. Sometimes that's all it takes. The simplicity of the statement seemed to anger him more than defiance would have. Stay away from my son, he said, his voice cold and final. You're here to clean, not to play therapist. If I catch you interacting with Ethan again in any capacity, you're fired. Do I make myself clear? Yes, sir. Maya stood, smoothing her uniform. Perfectly clear. She turned towards the door. Wait. Robert's voice stopped her. She turned back. He looked like he wanted to say something else, something that didn't quite fit the anger he was projecting. But then the moment passed, and his expression hardened again. You're dismissed. Maya left the office, closing the door quietly behind her. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her sides and walked back to the laundry room with her head held high, even though her heart was pounding hard enough to hurt. That evening, during dinner service, Ethan had a breakdown. It started without warning. One moment he was sitting quietly at his usual spot in the small dining room while Robert met with associates in the formal dining area. The next moment, Ethan was standing, his chair knocked backward, his face twisted in something beyond frustration, pure, overwhelming desperation. He grabbed his plate and threw it. The ceramic shattered against the wall, food splattering across expensive wallpaper. Then the glass. Then the silverware. Each throw was precise and controlled, not random violence, but targeted destruction. Caroline and Michelle rushed towards him, trying to calm him, trying to gently restrain him. Ethan pulled away from them, backing into a corner. His mouth opened in what might have been a scream, though no sound came out. His hands moved frantically, not in formal signs, but in desperate, broken gestures that meant nothing and everything. The noise, or rather the crash of breaking dishes, brought Robert running from the formal dining room. He burst through the door and froze, taking in the scene, his son, cornered and wide-eyed, the two nannies hovering helplessly, the destruction scattered across the floor. Ethan! Robert's voice cut through the chaos. Stop this right now! But Ethan wasn't hearing him, wasn't seeing anything except whatever nightmare was playing behind his eyes. His hands kept moving, kept forming shapes that almost looked like signs but weren't quite complete, like someone trying to speak a language they had forgotten. Robert moved closer, more slowly now. Ethan, please calm down. We can. Ethan's hand shot out, pointing, not at Robert, not at the nannies, but across the room, through the open doorway into the hall beyond. Maya stood in that hallway. She had been passing by when she heard the crash, had stopped because her instincts told her something was wrong. She stood in the doorway now, frozen, watching the scene unfold. Ethan's eyes locked on her. His hands continued moving, forming one specific gesture over and over. It took Maya a moment to recognize it. The sign was old, outdated, not taught in modern ASL, but she knew it. She had seen it in her mother's old books, had learned it when studying the evolution of sign language. Where? Ethan was asking where someone was, not looking for a place, looking for a person, the way a child might ask where their mother was. The gesture Clara had used. The gesture only someone who knew the older forms of signing would recognize. The room seemed to freeze. Everyone was looking at Maya now. Caroline and Michelle looked confused. Robert looked stricken, recognition dawning in his eyes. Maya took one step forward, then stopped herself. She remembered Robert's warning, stay away from Ethan. Don't interact. Don't cross that line. But Ethan's entire body was shaking. His breathing was rapid and shallow. The panic attack was escalating, and no one in that room could reach him. She looked at Robert. Their eyes met across the chaos of broken dishes and desperate child. She saw fear there, Real, raw fear, not of her, but of losing his son completely. The question hung between them, unspoken but clear: what matters more? Pride or help? Authority or connection? Maya took another step forward. Robert didn't stop her. She crossed the room slowly, carefully, avoiding the broken ceramic. She didn't rush, didn't speak, didn't make any sudden movements. When she was a few feet from Ethan, she stopped. And she slowly raised her hands and signed back. Here. One word, simple and clear, using the same old form he had used, meeting him where he was, not where people thought he should be. Ethan's breathing stuttered. His hands stopped their frantic movement. He stared at Maya like she was something impossible, something that shouldn't exist, but did. She signed again, expanding slightly. You're safe. I see you. The words weren't just translated, they were meant. Every gesture carried weight, intention, presence. This wasn't performance. This wasn't technique. This was recognition. Ethan's shoulders dropped. The rigidity left his spine. He took one shaky breath, then another. The breakdown didn't vanish completely. The trauma was still there, the grief and fear and confusion, but it receded enough that he could breathe. Enough that he was present again instead of lost. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, the first conscious acknowledgement he had given anyone in 7 months. The room remained silent. Robert stood frozen, his carefully constructed world cracking open right in front of him. Caroline whispered something to Michelle about credentials and appropriate boundaries, but her voice sounded hollow even to herself. Dr. Schmidt, who had appeared in the doorway at some point during the crisis, cleared his throat. This is highly inappropriate. This staff member is engaging in emotional manipulation. She's creating a dependency that will ultimately harm the child's development. This should be stopped immediately. Robert raised one hand, silencing the doctor without looking at him. His eyes were still on his son, on Maya, on the impossible thing that had just happened. Get out, he said quietly. Dr. Schmidt blinked. I'm sorry. I said get out. You're fired. Mr. Sterling, I must protest. Your services are no longer required. Mrs. Davison will handle your payment. Leave now. The doctor's face flushed red, but he had enough sense not to argue further. He turned sharply and left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Robert looked at Maya. His expression was complex. Anger and gratitude and fear and something that might have been hope, all tangled together. When he spoke, his voice was rough. Can you stay with him? Just for tonight? Until he calms down completely? It wasn't phrased as an order this time. It was a request, almost a plea. Maya nodded. Yes, sir. And Maya? He paused, struggling with words. Thank you? She didn't respond to that. Just turned her attention back to Ethan, who was watching her with eyes that held more awareness than anyone had seen in months. That night, long after Ethan had been settled and the broken dishes cleaned away, Maya sat alone in her room. She didn't turn on the lights, just sat in the darkness, feeling the weight of what had happened settle over her. Outside her door, she heard a soft sound. When she opened it, she found a cloth napkin folded into a spiral. Next to it was a small piece of paper with 3 words written in a child's careful handwriting: You stayed here. Maya picked up both items, tears burning behind her eyes, and closed her door quietly. Everything had changed, and there was no going back. The morning after Ethan's breakdown, the entire household moved differently. Staff members spoke in hushed tones, their usual routines disrupted by an unspoken awareness that something fundamental had shifted. Mrs. Davison walked the halls with tight lips and narrowed eyes, her disapproval radiating like heat. The 2 nannies, Caroline and Michelle, packed their belongings without being asked to leave. They simply understood their services were no longer required. Robert hadn't slept. He sat in his office as dawn broke, staring at the same security footage he had watched a dozen times. The moment when his son signed, played on a loop in his mind. That single gesture, outdated, desperate, heartbreaking, had torn away every excuse he had built around his failure to reach Ethan. His son hadn't stopped communicating. Robert had stopped listening in a language that mattered. The realization sat heavy in his chest, sharp and unforgiving. Clara had known that sign. She had used it daily with Ethan, part of their private vocabulary that blended old forms with new. Robert had been present for thousands of those conversations, watching from the sidelines, never quite learning the language himself, too busy, too important, too confident that his wife would always be there to translate. Now she was gone, and Ethan had been asking, "Where?" for 7 months, asking in a language only one person in this entire estate had bothered to learn. A maid, a woman he had barely noticed until yesterday. A woman who had seen his son more clearly in 3 weeks than Robert had in 7 months. Around 8 in the morning, Robert summoned Maya to the breakfast room, not his office this time, somewhere less formal, less confrontational. He sat at the small table where Ethan usually took his meals, 2 cups of coffee growing cold in front of him. Maya entered quietly, her uniform pressed and neat, her expression carefully neutral. She didn't sit until Robert gestured to the chair across from him. "I owe you an apology," Robert said without preamble. The words felt foreign in his mouth, rough and unpracticed. "Yesterday, I accused you of overstepping. I was wrong." Maya said nothing, just watched him with those calm, observant eyes. "You were right," he continued, forcing himself to maintain eye contact. "I wasn't listening. I was so focused on fixing him, on finding the right expert or the right method, that I missed what he was actually trying to say." He paused, his jaw working. His mother would have seen it immediately. "You were grieving too," Maya said softly. "It's hard to see clearly when you're drowning." The kindness in her voice nearly undid him. Robert looked away, composing himself. "I need your help," he stated. "Not as staff. As someone who understands my son better than I do right now." The admission cost him something, but he forced it out anyway. "Will you stay? Work with Ethan? Help him. Help us find a way forward." Maya was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that made Robert look at her more closely. "This isn't temporary for him. You understand that, right? I can't be someone who comes into his life, builds his trust, and then disappears when it becomes inconvenient. If I do this, I need to know you're committed to seeing it through. Whatever that looks like." "I am," Robert said immediately. "Whatever it takes. Even if people judge you for it? Even if your business associates think it's strange that a maid has such access to your son? Even if your family questions your judgment?" Robert's expression hardened, but not with anger, with resolve. "Let them question. My son comes first." Maya studied him for another moment, then nodded. "Okay, but I have conditions." "Name them." "I'm not a therapist. I won't pretend to be. Ethan needs professional support, real support, not people trying to force him into boxes. But those professionals need to understand that communication isn't one size fits all." She leaned forward slightly. "And I need you to be part of this. You need to learn his language too. Not just watch from the sidelines. Actually learn it." Robert felt something in his chest tighten, fear maybe, or shame. But he nodded. "I'll do it. One more thing," Maya added. "This stays about him. Not about proving anything to anyone. Not about optics or image or what makes you look like a good father. Just him, his needs, his pace." "Agreed." They sat in silence for a moment, an understanding settling between them that felt more binding than any formal contract. "He left something outside my door last night," Maya said quietly. "A note. It said you stayed here." Past tense, like he was surprised. Robert closed his eyes briefly. "Everyone else left. Every nanny, every therapist, every specialist. They all gave up and walked away. Of course, he expected you to leave, too." "I won't," Maya said simply. "Not unless he asks me to." That afternoon, Ethan came downstairs to find Maya waiting in the small sitting room adjacent to the library. She didn't rush towards him, or make a grand production of the moment. She simply sat in a chair near the window, afternoon light streaming through the glass, and acknowledged his presence with a small nod. Ethan stood in the doorway for several minutes, just watching, testing, seeing if she would push or demand or need something from him. Maya pulled out a sketch pad and a set of colored pencils. She began drawing. Nothing specific, just shapes and patterns, spirals, circles, geometric designs. She worked quietly, humming softly under her breath the way she had that night in the breakfast room weeks ago. Slowly, tentatively, Ethan moved into the room. He didn't sit next to her. He sat on the floor near the bookshelf, several feet away, where he could see what she was doing without being too close. Maya noticed, but didn't comment, just kept drawing. After a while, she set down one colored pencil and picked up another, red instead of blue. She drew a new spiral, this one tighter and more complex. Ethan watched her hand move. His own fingers twitched against his knee, mimicking the motion unconsciously. Then he signed something small and quick, as if testing whether she was really paying attention. More. Maya's hand stilled. She looked at him, not with excitement or triumph, just quiet acknowledgement. Then she drew another spiral and another, creating a pattern across the page. Ethan signed again, more confidently this time. Different. Maya changed the pattern, made the spirals irregular, made some large and some small, created asymmetry where there had been order. Ethan's shoulders relaxed. He moved slightly closer, still on the floor, but no longer pressed against the wall. He signed a more complex thought, his hands moving with increasing fluidity. She made patterns different every time. He was talking about his mother. Maya understood immediately. She sounds creative. Maya signed back, keeping her movements gentle and unhurried. She was teaching me. Ethan's hands moved faster now, 7 months of silence breaking open like a dam, finally cracking. We were going to make a book with all the patterns. She said, patterns tell stories. What kind of stories? Any kind. Ethan's expression flickered with something that might have been the ghost of a smile. Happy ones, sad ones, angry ones. She said, every feeling has a shape. Maya set down the sketch pad. She signed carefully, giving Ethan time to process each word. What shape is today? Ethan thought about that. His hands moved through several different attempts before settling on an answer. Broken circle trying to close but doesn't know how. The honesty of it stole Maya's breath. She nodded slowly. That's a good shape. Honest. They sat together in that room for 2 hours. Sometimes signing, sometimes just existing in parallel silence. Maya never pushed, never demanded more than Ethan was willing to offer. And slowly, incrementally, he began to unfold. Later that evening, Maya found Robert in his study. She knocked softly, and he looked up from his laptop with exhausted eyes. He talked, she said simply. Really talked. About his mother, about patterns they used to make together. Robert's expression cracked. What did he say? Maya told him, watching as each detail landed like a stone in water. When she finished, Robert was quiet for a long time. I didn't know about the book, he finally said, his voice rough. She never told me about the pattern book. Maybe she was waiting for the right time, Maya offered. Or maybe it was their special thing. Something just for them. Robert nodded slowly, then looked at Maya with something that might have been desperation. Teach me the signing. The way you do it, not textbook, the way that actually reaches him. It's not just about the signs, Maya warned. It's about intention, presence, being willing to exist in his world instead of demanding he exists in yours. I know, Robert said quietly. I'm ready to try. That night, Maya lay in her small room and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had taken on. The responsibility was enormous. Ethan's trust was fragile, hard-won, and could shatter at any moment. Robert's commitment was real, but new, untested, under pressure. And the household staff's resentment was already building like storm clouds on the horizon. She thought about quitting, about walking away before she became too invested, before the inevitable complications arose, before caring too much made everything hurt more. But then she remembered Ethan's hands signing. You stayed here. And she knew she couldn't leave. Not now. Maybe not ever. The news spread through the household like wildfire within days. The maid, that quiet, unremarkable woman who cleaned tables and polished silver, now had special access to the young master. She spent hours alone with him in the sitting room. She took her meals in the small breakfast room where Ethan ate. She had the authority to request specific foods, specific activities, specific accommodations for the boy. The whispers started immediately. Mrs. Davison was the first to vocalize her concerns, cornering Robert in the hallway outside his office 3 days after Maya's new role began. "Sir, I must speak with you about this arrangement." Robert, who had been on his way to join Ethan and Maya for lunch, something he was doing daily now, learning to sign through observation and practice, stopped reluctantly. "What is it, Mrs. Davison?" "It's highly irregular, sir. Having someone with no credentials, no professional training, given such unrestricted access to a vulnerable child." Mrs. Davison's voice was tight with disapproval. "The other staff members are concerned. They're questioning your judgment." "Let them question," Robert said flatly. "Maya is helping my son in ways no one else has managed. That's all that matters." "But sir, the optics." "I don't care about optics." Robert's voice sharpened. "I care about my son. If you have concerns about Maya's conduct, specifically actual misconduct, not just discomfort with the arrangement, bring them to me with evidence. Otherwise, this conversation is over." Mrs. Davison's mouth thinned into a hard line. "Very well, sir." She turned and walked away, her spine rigid with offense. But the concerns didn't stop there. They multiplied. The cook mentioned to the gardener that it seemed strange, giving so much authority to someone so new. The gardener mentioned to the driver that it made him uncomfortable, the way the maid had wormed her way into the family's trust. The driver mentioned to the head of security that maybe they should keep a closer eye on things, just to be safe. Within a week, Mrs. Davison filed a formal complaint through the household management system. The document was precise and carefully worded, accusing Maya of creating emotional dependency in a vulnerable child, of overstepping professional boundaries, and of manipulating the situation for personal gain. It stopped just short of accusing her of intentional harm, but the implications were clear. Robert read the complaint in his office, his jaw clenching tighter with each paragraph. When he finished, he called Maya in to discuss it. "I need you to read this," he said, handing her the document. "And I need your honest reaction." Maya read slowly, her expression remaining calm even as the accusations piled up. When she finished, she set the papers down carefully. "They're afraid," she said simply. "Of what?" "Of change. Of someone disrupting the established order. Of the fact that I'm reaching Ethan when people with more credentials couldn't." She paused. "And maybe they're afraid I'll take advantage of that access. Use it for money or position or attention. Will you?" Robert asked, watching her closely. "No." The word was firm, unequivocal. "I'm here for him. That's all." Robert believed her, but he also understood that belief wasn't enough in the world he occupied. Perception mattered. Whispers became rumors. Rumors became scandals, and scandals destroyed reputations faster than any truth could rebuild them. That evening, Robert hosted a small dinner for close business associates, people he considered friends as much as colleagues. Maya served, as she often did during formal dinners, moving through the room with quiet efficiency. One of the guests, a silver-haired investor named Thomas Anderson, watched Maya refill his wine glass and then leaned toward Robert with a knowing smile. "I heard you've got quite the situation developing here. The help getting a bit too familiar with the family." Robert's hand tightened around his own wine glass. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Come on, Robert. Word gets around. You've given this maid carte blanche with your son. People are talking." Thomas's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure you have your reasons, but you need to think about how this looks. Optics matter in our world. Ethan is responding to her," Robert said tightly. "After months of failed interventions, he's finally making progress. That's what matters." "Does it?" Thomas set down his glass. Because what I'm hearing is that you've allowed an uncredentialed staff member to bypass every professional recommendation. That you've given her authority she hasn't earned. That looks like desperation, Robert. Or worse, poor judgment. Or it looks like a father doing whatever it takes to help his son. It looks like vulnerability. Another guest interjected. Margaret Harrison, a board member of one of Robert's charitable foundations. Vulnerability invites scrutiny. Lawsuits. Questions about your capacity to make sound decisions in other areas of your life. Robert felt anger rise hot in his throat. Are you seriously suggesting that helping my son makes me incapable of running my businesses? I'm suggesting that the methods you're using are questionable, Margaret said, and that you need to consider the broader implications. What happens if this woman decides she wants more? What happens if she claims some kind of emotional bond with your son and demands compensation or custody rights, or threatens to go public with a story about how you gave a black maid access to your vulnerable white child in ways that could be misinterpreted? The racial element had been lurking beneath every criticism, unspoken but present. Margaret had finally voiced it, and the room went silent. Robert stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. Get out. Margaret blinked. Excuse me? I said get out. All of you. This dinner is over. Robert, we're trying to help you. By suggesting that Maya is dangerous because of her race? By implying that her competence is somehow suspicious because she doesn't have the right credentials or the right background? Robert's voice was cold with fury. No, you're not helping. You're revealing exactly the kind of thinking that's kept my son isolated for 7 months. The assumption that caring has to look a certain way, come from certain people, follow certain rules. You're wrong, and I want you out of my house. The guests exchanged uncomfortable looks, then began gathering their belongings. Thomas tried one more time. You're making a mistake, Robert. This will come back to haunt you. Then let it haunt me. At least I'll have helped my son. After they left, Robert stood alone in the dining room, his hands shaking with anger and something that felt like fear. Had he made the right choice? Was he being reckless? Was he putting Ethan at risk by trusting Maya so completely? Maya appeared in the doorway, having heard most of the confrontation from the hall. You should listen to them, she said quietly. Robert turned to her, startled. What? They're not entirely wrong. The optics are bad. The situation is unusual, and I am creating a dependency with Ethan. She stepped into the room, her expression serious. If you need me to step back, I will. If protecting him means protecting you from criticism, then maybe that's what needs to happen. No, Robert said immediately. No, you're not leaving. But if it's hurting you, I don't care if it hurts me. Robert moved closer, his voice intense. I care if it hurts Ethan, and losing you would destroy him. I'm not letting that happen. Maya held his gaze for a long moment. Okay then. We do this together, and we deal with whatever comes. But what came next was worse than criticism. Robert's brother, David Sterling, arrived at the estate 2 days later with a lawyer. David was younger by 3 years, sharper in appearance, colder in demeanor. He had always resented Robert's position as head of the family business, and he seized on this situation like a weapon he'd been waiting to find. I'm filing for emergency custody evaluation, David announced in Robert's office, his lawyer standing silently behind him with a briefcase full of documents. On the grounds that you're making decisions that endanger Ethan's welfare. Robert stared at his brother in disbelief. You're trying to take my son? I'm trying to protect my nephew from your increasingly erratic behavior. David's tone was smooth, practiced. You've fired multiple qualified specialists. You've given unrestricted access to an uncredentialed staff member. You're isolating him from professional help. A judge will see that as unstable. Ethan is improving. He's communicating again. He's eating regularly. He's dependent on a woman who could walk away at any moment, leaving him more traumatized than before. David interrupted. That's not improvement. That's creating a new problem. The lawyer stepped forward, handing Robert a folder. These are preliminary filings. We're requesting a full psychological evaluation of both you and the child, as well as an investigation into the appropriateness of the current care arrangements. You'll have an opportunity to respond through your own legal counsel. Robert felt the world tilt. This wasn't just criticism anymore. This was a real threat. David could actually take Ethan away, put him in a facility, undo everything that had been built over the past few weeks. Why are you doing this? Robert asked his brother, his voice hollow. David's expression softened slightly, almost convincingly. Because someone has to. You're not thinking clearly. You're so desperate to fix Ethan that you're grasping at anything that seems to work, even if it's not sustainable. Even if it's potentially harmful. Get out, Robert said quietly. David, get out of my house, and tell your lawyer that if you want a fight, he'll get one. But I'm not giving him my son. After they left, Robert sat alone in his office for a long time. He thought about calling his own lawyers, about preparing for a custody battle that could tear his family apart publicly, about the possibility of losing Ethan to his brother's cold, calculated care. But mostly he thought about the moment yesterday when Ethan had signed to him directly for the first time. A simple question. Are you learning? Robert signed back, clumsy but earnest. Yes. Teach me. And Ethan had smiled. A real, genuine smile. The first one since Clara died. That memory steeled his resolve. Whatever it cost, whatever battles he had to fight, Robert wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. He found Maya in the sitting room with Ethan, working on a new pattern book together. They looked up as he entered, and Robert saw the question in Maya's eyes. She had heard about David's visit. We're going to be okay. Robert signed to Ethan. The movements were still awkward but clear enough. All of us. Ethan looked at his father, then at Maya, then back at his father. His hands moved in a sign Robert had learned just yesterday. Together. Together, Robert confirmed. And for the first time in 7 months, Robert Sterling felt like he might actually keep that promise. The custody evaluation process began 2 weeks after David's threat. A court-appointed psychologist named Dr. Anna Reed arrived at the estate with a briefcase full of assessment tools and a carefully neutral expression. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a methodical approach, someone who had clearly evaluated hundreds of complicated family situations and learned not to make assumptions. Robert met her at the door personally, his anxiety barely concealed beneath a veneer of professional courtesy. Thank you for coming, Dr. Reed. Mr. Sterling. She shook his hand firmly. I want to be clear about my role here. I'm not here to take sides. I'm here to assess what's in Ethan's best interest. That means I'll need access to everyone involved, you, your son, and Miss Jackson. Of course, whatever you need. Dr. Reed spent the first day observing. She watched Robert and Ethan at breakfast, noting how Robert signed with increasing confidence, how Ethan responded with patience when his father made mistakes. She watched Maya work with Ethan in the sitting room, documenting the ease of their communication, the way Ethan relaxed in her presence. She reviewed medical records, therapy notes from the failed interventions, and security footage from the past month. On the second day, she interviewed Robert alone in his office. Tell me about your decision to allow Miss Jackson to work with Ethan, she said, her pen poised over her notepad. Robert chose his words carefully. Every specialist I hired approached my son like a problem to be solved. Maya approached him like a person to be understood. The difference was immediate and undeniable. But she has no formal credentials. She has something more important. The ability to see him, to listen in ways that don't require sound. Robert leaned forward. My son was dying inside, Dr. Reed. Not physically, but emotionally. He was disappearing. Maya brought him back. I don't care what her resume says. And if she leaves? If she decides this is too much responsibility or finds another opportunity, what happens to Ethan then? The question hit Robert like a physical blow, because he had asked himself the same thing 100 times. Then we deal with it. But pushing her away now, when he's finally healing, would cause more damage than any hypothetical future loss. Dr. Reed made notes, her expression unreadable. Your brother suggests you're acting out of desperation rather than sound judgment. My brother wants control of my assets, Robert said bluntly. He's using my son as a weapon to get it. If he truly cared about Ethan's welfare, he would have visited once in the 7 months since my wife died. He didn't. Not until he saw an opportunity. On the 3rd day, Dr. Reed interviewed Maya in the small breakfast room. Why did you get involved? She asked. You could have stayed in your role as household staff. You chose to cross a significant boundary. Because no one else was seeing him, Maya said, considering the question carefully. They were seeing deafness, trauma, resistance. They weren't seeing a child who was communicating as clearly as he could and being ignored. You understand that you've created a significant dependency. Ethan relies on you in ways that could be problematic if you're not committed long-term. I am committed, Maya said firmly. I wouldn't have started this if I wasn't prepared to see it through. Even if it costs you other opportunities? Even if it limits your own freedom? Even then. Maya met Dr. Reed's eyes steadily. I had a cousin who was deaf. The world tried to force him to communicate on its terms. It almost broke him. My aunt and I learned to meet him where he was instead. It saved his life. I'm not going to let Ethan go through what Marcus almost went through. Dr. Reed made more notes. You understand that emotional connection isn't the same as professional competence? Yes, that's why I've been researching certification programs. I want to formalize what I'm doing, not replace professional support, but complement it. Maya paused. But credentials won't make me care more than I already do. They'll just make other people more comfortable with the fact that I care. On the 4th day, Dr. Reed spent time alone with Ethan. She had arranged for Maya and Robert to be elsewhere in the house, wanting to see how Ethan functioned without his support system immediately present. She entered the sitting room where Ethan was working on his pattern book, a large sketch pad filled with spirals and geometric shapes, each page more complex than the last. He glanced up when she entered, acknowledged her presence with a small nod, then returned to his drawing. Dr. Reed sat across from him, not too close. She pulled out a tablet with communication software and showed it to Ethan. He looked at it briefly, then signed a simple response. Don't need it. Dr. Reed signed back, her movements textbook perfect but lacking the fluidity Maya had. I want to understand how you're feeling. Ethan studied her for a moment, then set down his colored pencil. His hands moved in more complex signs. You want to know if she's good for me? The directness startled Dr. Reed. Yes, that's part of what I'm trying to understand. She stayed. Ethan's signs were emphatic. Everyone else left. She stayed. But staying isn't always enough. Sometimes people stay for the wrong reasons. Ethan's expression shifted, something stubborn and certain settling into his features. He signed with deliberate clarity. She sees me. Not the deaf. Not the broken. Me. Do you think you're broken? The question hung between them. Ethan's hands went still, his face closed off, that familiar shutdown beginning to descend. Dr. Reed recognized the warning signs immediately, and shifted her approach. I am sorry, that was the wrong question. But Ethan was already standing, moving toward the door, not running, but retreating. Dr. Reed let him go, making notes about the interaction, about the trigger she had inadvertently hit. Ethan found Maya in the kitchen, helping prepare lunch. He stood in the doorway until she noticed him, then signed urgently. She asked if I'm broken? Maya set down the dish she was holding and gave Ethan her full attention. What did you tell her? Nothing. I left. Do you want to talk about it? Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he signed. Mom died because I'm broken. She was always fixing me. She got tired. The words hit Maya like a punch to the chest. She moved closer to Ethan, kneeling so they were at eye level. Ethan, look at me. Your mother didn't die because of you. She died because something in her brain broke without warning. Nothing you did caused that. Nothing you could have done would have prevented it. I couldn't call for help. Ethan's signs were becoming more frantic. I was in my room. She was downstairs. I didn't hear her fall. If I could hear, if I was normal, I could have saved her. Maya felt tears burn behind her eyes, but kept her expression steady. You're 9 years old. Even if you could hear, even if you had been right next to her, you couldn't have stopped what happened. It was an aneurysm. It was instant. No one could have saved her. Dad could have if he answered her call that night. The revelation made Maya's breath catch. What call? She called him the night before. He didn't answer. She left a message saying her head hurt. He didn't call back until morning. She was already dead. Ethan's whole body was shaking now. If he had answered, maybe she would have gone to the hospital. Maybe they could have fixed it. Maya pulled Ethan into a hug, feeling his small body tremble against hers. Oh, sweetheart, that's not how it works. Headaches happen all the time. No one could have known that one was dangerous. Your dad didn't ignore her on purpose. He was probably in a meeting or sleeping. He didn't know. But he should have known. He's supposed to know everything. Parents aren't perfect. They miss things. They make mistakes. They're human. Maya pulled back slightly to sign where Ethan could see. Your dad has been carrying that guilt, too. He thinks he failed both of you. He's been trying so hard to fix everything because he couldn't fix that one terrible thing. Ethan's signs were smaller now, exhausted. I waited for someone to understand. I waited for someone to stay long enough to see. I see you. Maya signed. I see exactly who you are, and you're not broken. You're grieving. There's a difference. They sat together on the kitchen floor for a long time. Eventually, Maya felt a presence in the doorway and looked up to find Robert standing there, his face pale. He had heard everything, or rather seen everything, the conversation playing out in signs he could now read well enough to understand. Robert moved slowly into the kitchen and knelt beside them. His hands moved in careful signs. I am sorry. I should have answered her call. I should have paid attention. I failed both of you. Ethan looked at his father for a long moment. Then he signed something that made Robert's composure finally crack. I waited for you to learn how to talk to me. I'm learning now. Robert signed back, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry I let you wait alone. Ethan studied his father's face, seeing the genuine remorse there, the grief that matched his own. Then he signed something that changed everything. Can we wait together now? Robert nodded, unable to speak, and pulled his son into his arms. Ethan let himself be held, really held for the first time in 7 months. The three of them sat there on the kitchen floor, a strange family held together by grief and understanding and the slow, painful work of healing. Dr. Reed found them there 20 minutes later. She stood in the doorway observing the scene and added one final note to her evaluation. A week later, Dr. Reed submitted her report to the court. David's lawyer called Robert immediately after receiving a copy. We're withdrawing the custody petition, the lawyer said, his tone clipped and professional. Dr. Reed's evaluation was conclusive. What did it say? Robert asked, though he already suspected. That Ethan is thriving under the current arrangement. That the unorthodox approach is producing measurable positive outcomes. That removing him from Miss Jackson's care would constitute emotional harm. The lawyer paused. She also noted that your brother has had no meaningful contact with the child and appears motivated by financial rather than welfare concerns. Robert closed his eyes, relief washing over him. Thank you for letting me know, Mr. Sterling. One more thing. Dr. Reed included a recommendation in her report. She suggests you formalize Ms. Jackson's role and provide her with the resources to obtain proper certification. She believes Ms. Jackson has the foundation to become an exceptional professional in this field with the right training and support. After hanging up, Robert found Maya in the sitting room, helping Ethan with his pattern book. He signed as he spoke, his movements now fluid enough to keep pace with his words. The custody challenge is over. We won. Maya's relief was visible. Ethan looked between them, understanding the significance, even if he hadn't been told all the details. "There's something else," Robert continued. "Dr. Reed recommended that I fund your certification. Full training, professional credentials, whatever you need. Not because what you're doing isn't working, but because you deserve recognition for it." Maya was quiet for a moment. "I've been looking into programs. There's one that specializes in emotional communication and trauma-informed signing. It's a 2-year program." "Do it," Robert said immediately. "Full funding, flexible schedule. You can continue working with Ethan while you study. We'll make it work." "Why?" Maya asked. "Why invest so much in me?" Robert looked at his son, who was watching this conversation with calm attention. Then back at Maya. "Because you invested in us when you had no reason to. Because you saw value where everyone else saw problems. Because you deserve the chance to do this for other families, not just ours." 6 months later, the Sterling estate looked the same from the outside, but felt entirely different from within. The tension that had permeated every room had dissipated, replaced by something that resembled peace. Ethan moved through the house with confidence now, signing freely with staff members who had begun learning basic signs themselves. The hostile whispers had faded, replaced by genuine curiosity and respect. Mrs. Davison had quietly resigned 2 months earlier, replaced by a younger head housekeeper named Jenny, who approached her role with less rigidity and more warmth. The remaining staff who had been resistant to change either adapted or found positions elsewhere. Those who stayed began to see Maya not as an intruder, but as someone who had changed the household for the better. Maya herself had changed, too. She still lived on the estate, but no longer in the staff quarters. Robert had converted a small guest house on the property into a private residence for her, complete with a study where she could complete her coursework and a small garden where she could decompress. She had completed her first semester of certification training with honors, her instructors noting her rare combination of natural talent and lived experience. Robert had also changed. He attended Ethan's therapy sessions now, real therapy with a trauma specialist named Dr. Chin, who understood that deafness wasn't a disorder to be fixed, but a difference to be accommodated. He learned not just sign language, but emotional literacy, processing his own grief alongside his son's. The carefully constructed walls he had built around his feelings began to crumble, and what emerged was a father more present and more honest than he had been even before Clara's death. On a bright afternoon in early autumn, Robert made an announcement at a board meeting for one of his charitable foundations. Maya sat in the back of the room, having been invited but not told why. "I want to talk about failure," Robert began, his voice carrying across the conference room filled with wealthy donors and community leaders. 7 months after my wife died, my son stopped communicating. I hired the best specialists money could buy. I threw resources at the problem. I demanded results. And every single approach failed. The room was silent, everyone leaning forward slightly. Robert rarely spoke about personal matters in professional settings. I failed because I was looking for experts who could fix my son, as if he were broken, as if his silence was a malfunction rather than a response to unbearable grief. Robert's voice remained steady, but emotion threaded through it. The person who finally reached him wasn't the most credentialed. She was the most present, the most willing to listen without needing to be right. He gestured to Maya. Maya Jackson started as household staff. She's now completing professional certification in deaf education and trauma-informed communication. But more importantly, she saw my son as a complete person when everyone else saw symptoms to manage. That changed everything. Robert pulled up a presentation on the screen behind him. That's why I'm announcing the Clara Sterling Foundation for Communication Access. We'll fund training programs for caregivers, parents, and educators who want to learn emotional signing and trauma-informed approaches. We'll provide scholarships for people like Maya, people with lived experience and natural talent who need resources to formalize their skills. And we'll advocate for changing how we think about communication differences. The room erupted in quiet conversation. Someone asked about funding levels. Someone else asked about program implementation. Robert answered each question with the kind of passion he usually reserved for business ventures. After the meeting, a few board members approached Maya directly. One woman, a former teacher, shook her hand warmly. "I've worked with deaf students for 20 years. What you've done, meeting the child where they are instead of where you want them to be, that should be standard practice, not revolutionary. Thank you for reminding us." That evening, Robert hosted a small dinner at the estate, just family, or what family had become, Robert, Ethan, and Maya. No formal table settings, no stiff adherence to etiquette. Just food and conversation, conducted partially in sign and partially in speech, flowing naturally between both. Ethan was working on his pattern book throughout the meal, adding details to a particularly complex spiral design. He had filled 3 books now, each one documenting different emotional journeys through abstract shapes and colors. His therapist had suggested he might want to share them eventually, that other children dealing with grief might find meaning in them. Robert watched his son work, then signed a question. "Are you happy?" Ethan considered the question seriously before responding. "Not all the time. But enough times. More than before." "That's honest." Robert smiled. "What about right now? This moment?" Ethan looked around the table, at his father who had learned his language, at Maya who had stayed when everyone else left, at the pattern book that was becoming something meaningful. He signed simply. "Right now is good." Later, after Ethan had gone to bed, Robert and Maya sat in the study, reviewing applications for the Foundation's first scholarship program. They worked in comfortable silence, occasionally discussing candidates or program details. "You're really going to do this?" Maya said, looking at the funding allocations. "You're committing serious resources. I should have done it years ago. Clara would have wanted this." Robert set down the papers he was reviewing. "She used to talk about creating something for deaf children beyond just education. Something that recognized the emotional dimension. I wasn't ready to hear it then. You're hearing it now because you made me listen." Robert met her eyes. "You know you don't have to stay here forever, right? Once you're certified, you could go anywhere, do anything, help hundreds of families." "I know." Maya smiled slightly. "But I made a promise to a 9-year-old boy that I would stay. I don't break promises. He's 10 now, and he's strong enough that he'd understand if you needed to move on. Maybe, but I'm not ready to move on." Maya paused. "This is the first place I've been in a decade that feels like home. I'm not giving that up easily." Robert nodded, understanding more than she was saying. "For what it's worth, we're grateful. Both of us. It's worth a lot." The Foundation launched officially 3 months later with a gala that Ethan attended, his first public event since his mother's death. He had been nervous about it, about being around so many people, about being perceived as different or broken. But Maya had helped him prepare, and Robert had promised they could leave at any point if it became too much. The gala featured artwork created by deaf artists, including several pieces from Ethan's pattern books, blown up and professionally framed. He stood in front of one, a complex spiral in blues and purples that he had titled 7 Months, watching people observe it, reading their reactions. A young woman approached him, her movements catching his attention. She signed a question. "Did you create this?" Ethan nodded. "It's beautiful and sad and hopeful all at once." She studied the spiral more closely. "I lost my mom too last year. Sometimes I feel exactly like this looks." Ethan signed back, his movements confident now. "That's why I made it. So people would know they're not alone." The woman smiled, tears in her eyes. "Thank you." After she walked away, Ethan found Maya in the crowd. He signed to her across the room, and she responded, and several people nearby noticed their conversation, not with discomfort or confusion, but with interest. The language was becoming less foreign, less intimidating, more beautiful in its clarity. At the end of the evening, Robert gave a short speech. He talked about Clara, about Ethan, about the journey that had brought them to this point. He talked about failure and learning and the courage it takes to admit you don't have all the answers. "My son taught me that listening doesn't require sound. Robert concluded. It requires presence, patience, and a humility to meet people where they are instead of demanding they come to where we are. That's not just advice for communicating with deaf children. That's advice for being human. The room erupted in applause. Ethan watched from beside Maya, his expression serious and thoughtful. Then he signed something that made Maya laugh. What did he say? Someone nearby asked. Maya translated. He said his dad finally learned how to talk. On the drive home, Ethan fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the evening. Robert glanced at him in the rearview mirror, then at Maya in the passenger seat. Thank you, he said quietly, for everything you've given us. You gave me something too, Maya replied. Purpose, family, a reason to become who I was always supposed to be. Still, thank you. They drove in comfortable silence the rest of the way home. The impossible arrangement that had started with spirals and silence now transformed into something permanent and real. In the back seat, Ethan dreamed of patterns, complex and beautiful, each one telling a story about grief and healing and the people who stay when staying is hard. When he woke up in the morning, he would add new patterns to his book. Patterns about belonging, about being seen, about the impossible becoming possible when someone cares enough to understand. And somewhere in those patterns, between the spirals and the shapes, was the truth no Nanny had understood until one Maid saw clearly, that listening is not about hearing. It is about presence. It is about staying. It is about seeing someone completely and choosing to understand their language rather than demanding they speak yours. That truth changed everything. And it started with a simple circle traced on a tablecloth, answered by a spiral that said, I see you. I'm here. I am staying.